G'day, I'm Mark Pesce, the Honorary Associate in the Digital Cultures Program at the University of Sydney. I'd like to talk to you about the history of virtual and augmented realities, basically explaining how they got started and how we ended up where we are today. So the root of most modern virtual reality comes out of a very specific problem. After the end of the Second World War, when jet fighter aircraft were starting to become a thing, the first major model produced in America was the F-86A Sabre. Here is the flight instrumentation. As you can tell, there's a lot of dials, and a pilot of this jet aircraft will need to keep their mind across most of those dials most of the time. And if they're in a combat situation, they need to do all of that while they're also maneuvering the aircraft to either outrun missiles from the enemy or to attack the enemy. And it is possible in this kind of aircraft to put the aircraft through such G-forces that it will basically disable the occupant of the vehicle. So at this point in time, we're starting to approach a sort of cognitive load where it is difficult, almost impossible, for an individual, no matter how accomplished, to stay across all of the instrumentation in the aircraft while also executing strategic plans in that aircraft, while also keeping themselves safe in that aircraft. So this produced a kind of problem that in America, the Defense Department was very interested in trying to solve. And eventually the solution, in fact, did start to evolve, but it took a little bit more than a decade. Now, the gentleman here is named Ivan Sutherland. Ivan Sutherland is the father of most of the things that we would consider modern computing. In 1963, he wrote a computer program called Sketchpad. It is effectively the very first interactive computer program. Anytime you touch the screen of your smartphone and it reacts, that is the basic innovation that he actually put forth in Sketchpad. And after he did that, he then sat and thought for a little while and started to dream up the idea of something he was calling the ultimate display. And in 1968, he prototyped what he called an ultimate display. This is a display where rather than having a display ranged around you, you would wear the display on your head. Your head would be tracked with this armature that you can see going off to the ceiling. And then the display would be showing you something inside that would be tracking appropriately to where your head was looking. So in other words, it was taking the world and the image of the world, passing that through, but then overlaying an image on top of it. So this is what we would now call augmented reality. He called it the ultimate display. In order to create this, he had to create a head-mounted display, something that did not exist. So he had to invent that. He had to create the head tracking technology, so he also invented that. And so that you had something to see in the system. And of course, you can see in this demo, what you're seeing are three-dimensional graphics being rendered in real time, even though they're wireframes, which are very simple. These are the very first real-time three-dimensional graphics that had ever been created by anyone. So Ivan Sutherland invented interactivity as we understand it. He also then invented augmented and virtual reality because you're seeing the world. So it's augmented reality rather than virtual reality. And to make it all work, he invented three-dimensional computer graphics. And he did this more than 50 years ago. Ivan is still with us. He's still working. He's still doing amazing things. You should look him up in Google. The Computer History Museum just did a great big series about his life and his work. But his work is fundamental to the field, and really with Ivan Sutherland's work, we get to the beginnings of what we now understand today as virtual reality. And of course, he was doing this all under the Defense Department budget because he's looking for the kind of solution to the problem that's being posed by the F-86 aircraft. All right, come along about 20 more years. And in this period of time, computers become smaller, they become faster, they become cheaper. They're still relatively large by modern standards, but they become good enough. And NASA now has a need for a system that will allow astronauts to practice missions outside the space shuttle. Now, if they're doing that on the ground, they would float them in a great big swimming pool and let them rehearse the mission over and over again so that the mission becomes muscle memory, so they don't have to think about it when they're actually outside the spacecraft, which is a dangerous situation. But if you're up in orbit and you need to go inspect the bottom of the spacecraft to find out if it's missing a panel or if something has broken, and it's something that comes up in the middle of the mission, how do you train the astronauts? Well, they came up with a system which would then produce a virtual reality view of the spacecraft by putting a display directly over the eyes, putting sensors on the arms and hands so that you could actually move your hands and their hands would be tracked and would be seen inside the virtual world. And all of this would work as a normal virtual reality system. Now, this is the virtual environment system, virtual environment workstation. This is the first we could think of as recognizably modern VR system. So from about 1985, 1986. And the interesting thing is, basically all VR systems look almost exactly the same today, right? You have a big display over the eyes, you have sound coming in over the ears, and you have sensors, controllers or sensors of some sort on the system. Now, in order for this system to work back in 1985, 1986, it needed to be powered by something around $1 million or $2 million of supercomputer. And I don't think they actually put that on the space shuttle. So while this was attempted for the space shuttle, it would have required a different revolution in computing and in electronics for it to actually work at scale. But that doesn't mean it wasn't highly influential. You took a look at those gloves that you saw there. Well, those gloves became the prototype for what Nintendo called the Data Glove. And in 1989, the Nintendo announced a virtual reality plug-in for the Nintendo Entertainment System called the Data Glove, which allowed kids to hold their hand out and to play games and to use the controller over here and all of that. And it was designed to be a very, very fun, adaptable interface. And Christmas Day in 1989, millions of kids opened them under the tree. They ripped them out. They plugged them into their Nintendo Entertainment Systems, and they hold it out and they play the game. And the problem here is, particularly for a child, but even for an adult, keeping your arm held out independently of your body for any length of time, which you needed to do in order to use the Power Glove, is not really doable for more than, say, a minute. If you're playing a game that's going to last maybe several minutes per level, well, effectively what you've done is you've designed a virtual interface for a real body that doesn't incorporate the factors of the real body. And so the Power Glove is one of Nintendo's biggest failures. Not that they didn't sell a lot at the beginning, but no one could use them. They created a virtual interface that was impossible for kids to use. This is an important lesson because just because it is possible to design something in virtual reality doesn't mean it's actually going to work in concert with the body. And there's this constant tug of war between what designers are capable of and what the body is willing to withstand. That forms a through line in the history of virtual and augmented reality. And I had my own experience of this. In 1993, I worked with Sega to help design the Virtua VR system, which was going to be the first sort of off-the-shelf consumer-grade VR system. It would plug into a Sega Genesis. This is a Sega Master System as it was sold in Australia. And it was all going to be powered off of the normal video game engine. And we built this, we prototyped it, we showed it to buyers. The buyers were incredibly excited. It won the Popular Mechanics Product of the Year award. So all of this was incredibly exciting, but when they actually started to produce these and then give these out to kids for testing, they realized that the kids were actually starting to get sick in these units because the display wasn't quite fast enough to keep up with the kids moving their heads. And when there's a significant discrepancy between moving your head around and when your display is moving around, it tends to make people motion sick. And that motion sickness will vary by age, it will vary by health, but in a general sense, when these things aren't really, really tightly in sync, your body thinks you're getting sick, and it will want you to void the contents of your stomach. And so, although there had been an enormous amount of fanfare, basically Sega abandoned the product, just never talked about it, buried it without a trace, and consumer VR wasn't a thing properly for about another 20 years. So Sega tried to get a technology out before it was really ready to be compatible with the body. Now, after that project fell apart, I took the work that I was doing in VR and actually blended it with the, at that time, brand new World Wide Web to create something called VRML. So the idea is, okay, if we can't have head-mounted displays, at least we can have virtual worlds that will run inside of web browsers. And so this is something we would now call the Metaverse, being able to log on and be in a virtual world and be with other people. And VRML was the very first version of the kind of software infrastructure that we would need to create a globally connected community of people who are contained inside of a single or multiple virtual worlds, what we would call the Metaverse. That was very useful in its time, but one of the things that immediately became apparent is that although people were perfectly willing to visit virtual worlds, it was very difficult for people to make their own. And even today, the amount of skill that's required to create a virtual world is fairly substantial. It takes people time to really level up. We have some tools that will allow you to drag and drop things. Minecraft is a great example of how that can be done well. Roblox is a good example. But we really don't have tools for the mass internet that have really started to leverage that capability. And the other side of it is computers in 1994 really weren't very powerful. A garden variety PC could run Doom, which was an early 3D game, but couldn't really do anything particularly sophisticated. But things were about to change. So effectively, when the PlayStation 1 came out, which is 1995 and 1996, and one of the big titles for the PlayStation 1 was Tomb Raider, we started to see an acceleration of consumer electronics being able to do high-quality three-dimensional graphics. Before this, the driving factors for 3D graphics were actually mostly either military applications or industrial applications. From the PlayStation, it's now consumer applications. And the consumer companies, so Sony and Nintendo and Sega and Microsoft, put billions and billions of dollars of research into this work. And as you can see, over the 18 years from 1996 to 2014, computer graphics got much more realistic. And just in a practical sense, they got somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 times better. So things that were extremely hard to do in 1996 were extremely easy to do in 2014. So this gap and the other side of this gap meant that there were some things that were possible that would have been completely inconceivable before 1996. And we got our first taste of those in 2015. So at the Google I/O conference in 2015, two engineers from Google France got up on stage and said, hey, we've done this crazy thing. We took a pizza box and we folded it up and we took some really, really cheap plastic lenses and we stuck them in the pizza box. And then we folded the pizza box up so that we could slide our smartphone in it. And we wrote some software for our smartphone that divided its display into two halves, one for the left eye and one for the right eye. And you pop it up on your head and oh my goodness, you've got virtual reality. And this was Google Cardboard. And it basically turned nearly every smartphone. And by 2014, there's a few billion smartphones out there in the world, turns basically every smartphone into a possible virtual reality system. And you have to understand how big a transition moment this is, because when these folks from Google got on stage, the number of VR systems globally was in the low thousands. When they get off the stage, the number of VR systems is in the low billions. This is literally a 0 to 1 moment in the history of virtual reality. And it shows up more professionally. Samsung does a Gear VR, and they build specific smartphones that are really good at being able to do. Smartphones start getting really, really good at doing really high-quality 3D. But the other thing that's happening now is people who have been working on real VR systems, not just versions of smartphones, realize that all of the technology that's been put into the smartphone can be repurposed, can be rearranged to create high quality and inexpensive virtual reality systems, because the components that they need are now very available and very inexpensive. And so what we see then from 2016 is an explosion in virtual reality systems. You get the HTC Vive, you get the Meta Quest, what was at that time the Oculus, and you also get the PlayStation VR. And the PlayStation VR is what we were trying to do with Sega in 1993, but it took all the way to 2017 to get that to a point where the technology was mature enough to be able to deliver it to market. So really almost a quarter of a century after we tried it, it was finally ready for use in a way that wouldn't make people sick. But again, all of these systems, if you break them down and you open them up and you take out their parts, what you will see is basically rearranged guts of smartphones. All right, so it's probably time to talk about some of the kinds of apps that we would use in virtual reality with this new generation. And there's a couple that I want to highlight here because I think they're so incredibly important. And I think one of the most important is an app called Tiltbrush, which was written by Google. Tiltbrush is, you can think of it as almost Photoshop but in 3 dimensions, so that rather than just painting on the screen, you're painting in 3 dimensions. And so you're painting inside the virtual world. So as you move the virtual, the paintbrush moves with you. And so you can paint objects that have not just color and light. And the lovely thing about this, particularly for people who are having their first reality experience, is something that feels very easy. It's like real, and it's got that same kind of Tiltbrush is a really new device that can complement precisely what it is. The interface is so much a one-to-one experience. All right, so that's a really good starting point to show people what's possible in virtual reality. But really, my favorite app, I think, in virtual reality is another one from Google. It's called Google Earth VR. Now, you've probably all used Google Earth on the desktop. Shows you the Earth from space. You can dive in. You can see places. Well, Google Earth VR is you're there. You are there for real. You dive in, and you're in all of the cities of the world at street level, above, around, wherever you want to be. And so it's really taken the data set that is the Earth, all of that located data that we think of associated with the planet, and it's presented it in the most natural way, a way that makes it really easy to be able to explore it, to play with it, to add to it, all of the things that you want to think about. I find with Google Earth, you can spend hours in there. And it is a great way to be able to see the world without actually having to be able to physically travel the world. So for people who can't because of mobility issues, it's also for that reason a revelation. All right, so you have these kinds of drawing simulations, you have this experience of the world simulation, but now we actually start to see a new class of apps from about 2018, which are pure simulations. And my favorite one of those is called Soundstage. So Soundstage is an app that would be used by electronic musicians. And what it does is it creates a virtual sound studio with virtual devices in that studio. And you plug them together, one device in another device. You patch them and to create a new set of instruments in the sound studio. This is exactly what people would be doing for love this tool. But you can also imagine, well, what if it's not an electronic musician? What if it's someone who's working perhaps with maybe data that's connected to the flow of goods? Maybe it's logistics. Maybe it's a supply chain, and the things that they're plugging together are connected to that. So maybe you're thinking about something that looks less like this and more like what we think a spreadsheet should do, but is a bit more of an interactive simulation. And this is, I think, the next place that these things are going, where these simulations aren't just about the creative play, but are actually about intellectual pursuit and creating models. And every spreadsheet is a model. Every spreadsheet is a simulation. This is simply the next place those sorts of tools will go. Now, where are we going from here? We've had a really good run with a current generation of virtual reality. The next place we seem to be going is something called Videogrometry. Now, there's a basic problem in virtual reality in that it is very difficult to get a human body in virtual reality. A lot of fun has been made of Meta's Horizon worlds where people are presented as cartoonish avatars that often don't even have legs. It's because it's actually furiously hard to represent a real body in virtual reality, or at least it was until the middle of the 2010s when a set of techniques called videogrammetry was developed. And videogrammetry effectively works by placing cameras all around an individual, many different angles. All of these cameras are filming that individual simultaneously. All of that footage is being put together and synthesized inside of a very, very smart computer program that takes all of these different points of view and from that produces a 3D, actually 4D because it's 3 dimensions plus time, of that person as if they're physically present. And what happens here is that this is now no longer an avatar. It's no longer a simulation of a body. It's a representation. So it's the difference between a cartoon and a video of a person in 2D, but this is now in 3 dimensions. And it really does produce some very compelling results. So this is a
Harry,
video game that was produced by
tell me, where do I go when you wake up?
Called Awake.
You're a hard man to reach, Harry.
Was captured in
Don't hurt.
Videogrometry. You
I
see,
can
they look
help
a
you.
lot more realistic than they would if they were just.
This is never going to work.
characters.
Never works.
We are
And
all
so
here
it's that
for
kind
you.
of tension
But you must
between the
accept
physical
your part
body
in
being
all this.
represented and the
Rose,
way we would want to
I have so many things I need to
represent
ask you
reality so that it
and explain.
brings natural responses.
I
to us.
know.
Because the difference
Can you
between
show
an
me
avatar
instead?
and a human body is.
You see, the problem is this.
There's a difference.
We identify in our experience
Perceive as being real human.
a differentiation between what we do and what happens to us.
Now, there's another kind of work that is possible to do in photogrammetry, videogrammetry. And this is a work called Paragirls. And Paragirls is set at
They
the
won by putting me in here, but
Parramatta
they didn't
Girls
beat me.
Reformatory School, which was closed. in
Okay, they were the
23 years ago. It
winners.
was
They
really
got to
quite a
shut the
torture
door.
place for girls
But
who were
I'm
placed
standing
in
here.
And
And
Paragirls,
it
what they
hasn't
did was they
beaten me.
scanned the entire facility, and they scanned it in 3 dimensions. And what they did is they created this model, as you can see, which is it's quite pixelated,
I
and
wonder
it's
sometimes,
intentionally
whether the
quite pixelated
cutaway
to give you that sense of it
signifies
both
something
being
or
there and
stands for
not
something
there.
else,
And
you
it's a
know,
psychogeography.
between
They have
a
situated
past and a present.
spaces where women are telling their stories as were captured by
And
the,
I- and
the
I knew
documentary
it was
creators
sort of
who created
trouble.
this work, and they're telling the
But
story
many
of
a
the
time
horrors that actually
I
took
couldn't
place
help myself.
at
I
the
used to
girls'
say, "What are you
reformatory."
looking at?
And so what it does is it creates
couldn't
this
help
feeling
myself.
of both being
Because
there
you knew what they
and
were
maybe not quite
Because not
being
only did
there,
you have to
but
watch
also
out
being
for the-
deeply embedded in the history
male
of the place because
predators,
you're
you also
hearing the
had to
stories.
be
So
careful
this
of
is a way to be able to bring the
female
real world
predators.
experience, real
Girls who,
physical experience, and
were
psychological
put up in a
experience
loft to
together
scrub. They
into
would
a single,
stand,
very effective
in
work.
one spot with a bucket and a scrubbing brush.
All right. So videogrammetry got us to the next level. But if you remember, we started way back in 1968 with Ivan Sutherland with an augmented reality system. Augmented reality actually comes before virtual reality, which you can say really doesn't kick off until you get to the NASA View Workstation. And in 2015, pretty much out of nowhere, Microsoft leaks that it has invented a fully self-contained augmented reality system, which they call the HoloLens. And an augmented reality system means that it has to be able to slide over your eyes, give you an unobstructed view of the world, but at the same time track that world so well that it can add things, what it calls holograms. They're not actual holograms, but they can add things to that world based on the device's model of the world so that the experience feels essentially seamless. So the first generation HoloLens was groundbreaking. The second generation HoloLens took a lot of what it had learned and brought it forward. Now, one of the things you need to note about augmented reality is revealed in the design of this headset. You can see that this headset is studded with cameras. These cameras are tracking both depth, and they're also tracking other things in the environment. Augmented reality systems need that sort of tracking because that's how they can tell in a space where you're looking. So they can tell that they're going to put a hologram here or they're going to put a hologram there, and when you look away and you look back, it will still be there because the headset itself will have mapped the space and it will know when you're looking one way or looking another way. All of that means that in order for augmented reality to work, It actually has to be conducting continuous detailed surveillance of any space where it's being used. So unlike virtual reality, augmented reality is by definition a technology of surveillance. We're at a point now where we're foreseeing that by the end of this decade, augmented reality systems, probably from Apple and from Meta, will be mass marketed to millions and millions of individuals, each of whom will be carrying around with them an incredibly capable and sophisticated surveillance system. We need to think carefully about what that will mean before that happens. Now, there's two sets of uses that Microsoft has identified as the first case uses for augmented reality. One of them goes back all the way to our beginnings, which is for military. So soldiers on the battlefield will be using this for command, communication, and control. So you can imagine a soldier on the battlefield having all of the battlefield information, where the enemy is, where the friendlies are, where the caches are. And all of that actually doesn't sound particularly weird to us, because we think if you're playing Call of Duty or anything like that, the heads-up display that you have in those games, that's essentially the same information. And of course, the military also knows that most of the soldiers who are in have grown up playing those sorts of games. And so in some ways, what they're doing is they're gamifying the battlefield using augmented reality. These systems have been used and they've been tested. So far, the soldiers have not been very, very happy with how they've gone. They find them more confusing and distracting than useful. I think that's because what we're starting to understand now is that augmented reality is a technology we may have, but augmented reality as a design ethic, how to make this simple and clear and useful for people who are in a high-stress situation, that's probably something that's going to take us quite some time to work out. All right, so military is one interesting use case, but the other interesting use case is the enterprise or industrial use case. And this really is about a quality that I call digital depth. Almost everything that is human manufactured in the world, anything that's artificial, carries a lot of data around with it. But that data is invisible. Either it's not actually embedded in the device itself, or if it is, it's not accessible to us. So for instance, if you open up the bonnet of a car and you look at the engine, generally it's just a big plastic cover on it now. But if the engine breaks, well, what do? You generally have to take it to the dealership. They have to plug it in. Then their dealer systems talk to the engine, tells you what's wrong, tells you how to fix it. What we really want is to be able to put on an augmented reality device which will allow us to stare at anything that we have sufficient interest in and have that device then talk to our augmented reality device to be able to reveal its inner state to us. So I call that digital depth. The entire world for the last 30 years has been building digital depth into it. There are so many connected devices. There's so many devices that we know so much about. None of that information is immediately revealed to us. We don't have any device capable of integrating our view of the world with that digital depth. And I think that this is probably going to be one of the great big wins, particularly for industrial and enterprise uses. We'll be using augmented reality to be able to look at things and to understand them far better than we could before. Well, then we come to modern uses of videogrammetry. And Google introduced
well over a year ago. Not being able to see my nephew in person is like, it makes me sad.
So imagine instead of looking at a screen, you're looking at a magic pane of glass. And through that glass, you're seeing another person on the other side.
Hi, can you see me? Say hi to Auntie. Oh my gosh, I love you.
Eddie! So, you look beautiful.
And then you just start having a conversation, just like you would if you were physically together.
Like, I feel like you're here.
This is wild. I can see that curl in your hair. I can see how your sweater is falling.
Yeah. But then you'll be saying, put on a little lipstick, Maury.
There are really three breakthroughs coming together here. One is the ability to capture people as they are. The second is the ability to compress that information and send it over existing networks efficiently. And the third is the ability to render that person viewable through a three-dimensional display. So it really feels like you're talking with someone right in front of you.
If you need
We see this as a first step at applying technology to solve that really important problem that we often want to be together and we can't.
Don't say goodbye. Don't go away. That was mind-blowing.
I've seen a lot, but I've never seen this.
I felt like she was present, and I felt like I was present in that moment too. It was like she was here.
Starline was introduced at the very, very peak of the pandemic when people were afraid that we weren't going to be able to touch one another again. And it struck a chord because at that moment it became clear that you could use technology to produce an experience of depth that's unlike a normal video call where you're just seeing a person on screen, but you're actually seeing them in Videogrometry. You're seeing them being represented in 3D. Now, that first pass of technology at Google was, of course, very expensive. It was all custom built. But it is reasonable to expect that by around the end of this decade, that technology is going to be relatively commonplace, could very well be built into our smartphones, or our tablets, or our laptops, and that making a call to someone and experiencing them in depth is not going to be something that's going to be an unusual experience, but will be our specific experience of how we connect with people in the world, and it will transform the nature of that kind of communication. It will also probably be a vehicle for entertainment, because imagine watching the sports that way as well. All of these things are now starting to be seen as the frontiers for virtual and augmented reality. They don't necessarily involve goggles, they don't necessarily involve spectacles, but what they do involve is providing a richer sensual experience, which brings us all the way back to the very beginning, because what people learned in trying to solve the problem of the jet fighter pilot was that the more tangible you could make the experience, the more immediate, the more possibilities and the more capability you give to people in those situations. Thank you very much.